Café Scientifique is a monthly series of expert-led discussions on science and culture presented by the Bell Museum of Natural History. For more information about the Bell Museum, or to find out about upcoming Café Scientifique programs, visit bellmuseum.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter.
Good evening and welcome to Café Scientifique. I'm one of your hosts. I'm Kevin Williams, and Leah Peterson is your primary host. She's the one that counts. Yay, all right. I'm retired. I'm just here because I am old and I look like science. And it gives the whole program. There are a lot of people here that have gray hair and look like they could give science some credibility. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Leah, and she is going to introduce our speaker. And yeah, there you go. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Most of you know that Kevin was, up until recently, our curator of education at the Bell Museum of Natural History. And in his glorious retirement, he has agreed to keep coming out for Café Scientifique, which is just a wonderful thing to have him. So let's give him another round of applause, please.
And I'm also available for plumbing and home remodeling projects.
That's right. Okay, and my name is Leah Peterson. I'm the curator of adult programs at the Bell Museum of Natural History. And thanks to you all for coming out and being here. It's lovely to see you. And it's cold, but it's going to get a little bit warmer tomorrow. So thanks for making the trip. We have recently been invited to do a new monthly, like it to be weekly, maybe it will be, monthly radio spot on KFAI. The Monday before every cafe at 7:45 in the morning. So if you're up, it's on Morning Blend on 90.3. We'll talk about a little preview of the upcoming cafe, and we're hoping to grow that into something a little bit more involved where our cafe presenters are going to, from the present or the past or future programs, are going to come join and do a little bit of an on-air interview as well. So, yes, John.
That's KFAI is also 106.7 in St. Paul.
Oh, well, thank you.
Besides 90.3 in Minneapolis.
Excellent. Thank you for mentioning that. I appreciate it. Tonight, our speaker is a mountaineer and a historian of British science who is local to the Montana State University in Bozeman, but he's here in Minneapolis for a year working on his new book, which is called, is it 7 Sciences, 7 Slopes?
Sure.
Okay, maybe it doesn't even have a title yet. That's how new it is.
That one sounds really good.
Okay, awesome. I think 7 Slopes, 7 Sciences might actually. That's my input. But studying 7 sciences as they developed around the world in 7 different mountain ranges. He is a historian also studying the Victorian physicist John Tyndall, and some of his own adventures as a mountaineer and scientist and science historian around the world, and particularly in the Swiss Alps. And so we're very lucky to have him with us tonight because he's not usually in Minnesota. So we like to take advantage of the people as they pass through, and we're thrilled to introduce Michael Reidy to you, Dr. Michael Reidy. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. Kevin and Leah have been wonderful guests, or hosts, for me today. I usually don't get filled with beer before I give a talk, so you'll have to watch it. It's kind of funny to call me a mountaineer. I suppose that would fly here, but not in Bozeman, Montana. But I'm sort of a part-time dirtbag climber, is the way I guess I would say it. I've been to one Café Scientifique in Bozeman, and it was very sciencey, and this one is not going to be. So the title is History, Mountaineering, Science, and it's going to sort of follow that order. I'm going to start with a little history and talk about John Tyndall, why he needs to be known better, what we're doing to make that happen. I'm going to talk a little bit about mountaineering, especially this route. It's the east arête of the Weisshorn in the Pennine Alps above Zermatt. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about some of the citizen science that I was involved in during the mountaineering. If you have questions throughout, you're welcome to ask them. I also know there'll be plenty of time afterwards. It's kind of hard to see, so you could yell out if you have any questions. So we can start with Tyndall. Tyndall is, in the 19th century, I would argue he'd probably be viewed as one of the most important, the most popular scientists that was alive, even more than, let's say, Darwin. Partly because he was responsible for popularizing science to the broader sort of elite, middle and upper classes in Britain. He worked at the Royal Institution of Great Britain, which is in London. He succeeded Michael Faraday, who succeeded Davy. So there were all of these great scientists, and their job was to perform the latest research in physics and chemistry in front of these elite audiences. So Tyndall was very well known as a scientist and as a popularizer. He's also especially known for this instrument. It's the ratio photospectrometer. Basically what it does is it allowed him to measure the absorption power of gases in the atmosphere, which is then how he came up with the natural greenhouse effect, or the experimental proof of natural greenhouse effect. And he created a lot of different instruments, and many of them are still around today. So just to very quickly kind of go through some of his highlights. He published 180 articles and 27 books. So this is a very slim outline. But in 54, he showed that light bends in a jet of water. It's the basis of all modern fiber optics. The atmospheric studies were published in 61. He showed why the sky is blue. It's known as Rayleigh scattering because Rayleigh mathematized it. But Tyndall was the one to first show it in a laboratory before Rayleigh mathematized it. Also, thermophoresis. It's also known as the Ludwig-Soret effect, not the Tyndall effect. Again, I think if Tyndall were better known, these things would be called after his name. He also was a great inventor. The fireman's respirator lasted into the 20th century, and he invented all sorts of humongous foghorns, and published a book on sound, which is probably his most famous book. And then he learned a new type of sterilization process, where instead of Pasteur sterilization, where you heat it up, he heated it, cooled it, and he showed that killed many more spores. And so that is still known today as Tyndallization. His science was good, but at the time you would have probably known him as a defender of science, and especially Darwinism. This is a caricature at the time. And if you go to the bottom left corner, you see Tyndall with Hooker and Huxley. And these were the three great defenders of the naturalist worldview. Darwin, who was sickly, kind of hid away in his own house, and let these three guys go to bat for him. Here's another caricature just coming out of the 19th century in the newspapers, and you'll see again in the bottom left where Darwin is this way to daylight. Tyndall was often representative as carrying the banner of science. He was very, he picked fights. So he's best known in the public for two main fights. One was in 72, and it was called the prayer gauge debate. So what he said if prayer worked, we should be able to separate hospitals out into wards and have every Christian pray for Ward A. And then you should see a mathematical effect on who is getting better or not. And this had especially a bad reception in the United States. In fact, all the Presbyterian churches around the East Coast had special meetings to pray for Tyndall's soul, all these things. The second one is known as the Belfast Address. It was the presidential address to the Belfast meeting of the British Association. And there he argued that naturalistic rather than theistic causes could and should take over all of what he called cosmological theory. That is, all science should answer these questions, and religion should no longer be allowed to even be part of the debate. It was part of his great defense for Darwinism, which was 59, so this was about 15 years later, and he kept that fight up all his life. This was also the great age of mountaineering. 19th century is the century of exploration. About mid-century, you started not only going into continents, into the poles and things in north and south, but you also went up and down. You went into the ocean. The laying of the telegraph cable is the early 60s in the Atlantic. But also you started going up into the mountains for scientific work. So it's no coincidence that right in the middle of the century is what is known now as the Golden Age of Mountaineering, or the invention of mountaineering. And Tyndall played a major part of that. Here he is in Switzerland. He liked to stay on the rocks while his guides kept to the couloirs. You'll notice the third guide has a barometer strapped to his back. He was one of the first mountaineers to actually go up and spend the night on cliff sides so that he could do two-day attacks instead of just one day. He climbed the Mont Blanc 3 times in total. His third time, he stayed on top of it for 22 hours, spent the night with the chemist Edward Franklin. And he did that so that he could perform experiments on top. This is the Monte Rosa group, also near Zermatt. Monte Rosa had been climbed, all of its major peaks. Tyndall was the first climber to climb it solo without a guide, which caused all sorts of problems because at the time you had to hire a professional guide. He refused to do it. So not only was he a pioneer of climbing, but a pioneer of guideless climbing, where you can actually go yourself without having to take a guide. He also was one of the people that first attacked the Matterhorn. This is kind of our usual view. I'll show you why it's so pointy later. This is from the side, and it gives you a better view. The Hornley Ridge is to your left. That's the one that was finally climbed. But it looks so dangerous from Zermatt that no one tried it. Everyone else tried the Italian side, called the Lion's Ridge. And Tyndall and Whymper kind of hopscotched each other every year. Whymper finally, after his 7th try, on his eighth try, he climbed the Swiss side and made it up. Carroll, his guide, then the next year climbed the Lion's Ridge for the first time, although Tyndall held the record for the highest in a peak. It's a subaltimate peak called Peak Tyndall. Tyndall was the first one to turn into a pass, so he climbed the Lion's Ridge and then down the Hornley Ridge. And that's just showing how they hopscotched each other on the bottom. But what he's best known for is arguably, at the time, certainly the hardest climb that had ever been climbed, including the Matterhorn, and that's the Weisshorn. Tyndall climbed it for the first time on August 19th, 1861, with his guide, Joseph Benin, and porter, William Wegener. So that was the major climb at the time. He came back sort of to Britain as a hero, climbing the unclimbable climb of the Weisshorn. So if Tyndall is this great scientist, if Tyndall is this incredible popularizer, if he is this great defender of naturalism and one of the world's greatest climbers in the 19th century, why don't we know about him? There's a interesting answer to that question. He's one of the only guys I've ever studied or known who died twice. The first time he died was on a cold day in December in Haslemere. It's right south of London. Physicist, 73-year-old. He's lying in bed, and he's got bedside table is littered with medications, including one he takes for his stomach and problems with his stomach, and another one, a very strong one, the chloral, that he takes for sleeplessness. Tyndall was a drug addict and an alcoholic at this point. His wife accidentally switched him and gave him an overdose of the sleep medicine chloral, and killing basically one of the greatest scientists of the 19th century. So that's his first death, a very accidental death. Louisa, who's 25 years younger than he was, felt horrible about it. So she demanded control of all his letters, all his correspondence, all of his journals, and all of his unpublished material so that she could write what's called a life in letters. All Victorians had lives and letters written right after their death. Darwin, Lyell, Hooker, Huxley, all of them. She was going to write his life in letters, but he was such a polymath and involved in so many things that she never did it. And she outlived him by 52 years. So for 52 years, nothing, absolutely nothing got published about Tyndall and his life. It's where historians start. And so for until 1945, no one didn't even know or have access to any of the material. When Louisa died, she left all the letters to the Royal Institution of Great Britain. So that's part of my research, is I'm trying to resurrect him as part of the John Tyndall Correspondence Project. It's a National Science Foundation funded project. The goal is to publish 18 volumes of his complete correspondence. That's over 8,000 letters. And the second goal, 2 volumes already out. The third one is coming out in a few months. And we'll put out one every 6 months for the next 7 years or so. The second is just to create a community around John Tyndall to study him. And that includes an international group, a collaborative project from undergraduates and graduate students to postdocs to junior colleagues and then senior academics. It's what we call big humanities. If you've heard of big science, it's very big, state-run sort of science. This is a version of that, but for the humanities. It is in 4 countries. It's 12 universities that are involved, and the 2 center universities are York in Canada, a guy named Bernie Lightman, and then Montana State. The letters are actually fascinating. 19th century letters fall apart very easily because post was so expensive, so they were very light. But they also saved by writing one direction and then writing over it in another. And so it's very hard. Also, because they were so light, they have gaping holes in them, right? And so trying to figure out or filling those holes is one of the reasons that I got on a plane and went to Switzerland. So the second part of the talk, I'll go into a little bit about my experience in Switzerland. Is this okay? Working out? Okay. All right. So me and my buddy, climbing partner, alpaca farmer, Dennis Duenas, and I flew to Zermatt, and we lived in the Zermatt campground for 2 months. It is the perfect place to see Switzerland because you see all the craziest people that have ever been to Switzerland. There's this one guy who lived in that yellow tent. He was from Japan, and he guided up all the Japanese people that came in town, and he would sit every night, all night long, and stare at the Matterhorn. Don't know when he slept. Don't know what else he did, but every time he went outside, he was smoking his roll-your-own cigarettes, staring at the Matterhorn. Those kinds of people. I don't know how many of you guys have been to Zermatt. It's a bunch of very rich people in brand new mountaineering clothing who never go to the mountains. And I must admit at this point, I was exactly the same way, except for the rich part. I had bought a bunch of brand new mountaineering equipment and had no idea how to mountaineer at all. Zermatt is also, it's in the shadow of the Matterhorn. It dominates not only view, but everything else about Zermatt. It's the Matterhorn Museum, which is full of sort of history of the sport. It has one picture of Tyndall, but it includes mostly about Edward Whymper, since he was the first one to climb the Matterhorn. But not only that, it was also the most infamous climbing accident in the history of mountaineering. On the first ascent, 7 people went up, but only 3 came down. Right at the top, on a mixed section of rock and ice, one of the people slipped. The rope broke. Big controversy whether they cut the rope or not, because it was going to take down everyone. And 4 people fell probably about 5,000 feet to their deaths. So, their clothes fused to their bodies, legless, armless, that sort of thing. And it made front page news, London Times, New York Times, for quite a while. And Whymper became this fascinating character. Of course, Whymper had help. It's the guides in Switzerland and the right is Benin. The guides were the ones that actually really did all the work, the human donkeys they called them, and they were the great climbers at the time. So one of the things we did is we went searching for Benin's grave. One thing Tyndall had said in his letters was, Benin's the strongest guy there is. He will always come for you. He will never let you die. If you die, he will die with you, which is exactly what happened to Benin. He led the Cree in 64, 3 years after climbing the Weisshorn with Tyndall, and died in an avalanche trying to save his British climbers. So we went and did stuff like that, looked for these people. We did do some archival work. I put in this picture because this guy only speaks German. He's the archivist at a place in Rwanda. And I don't speak good enough German to get along. But luckily his wife, and I'm sorry I cut her out of the photo, she was from Tupelo, Mississippi, which is 50 miles from where I grew up. She'd been living there 52 years, and she said, I'll translate the whole thing. So we got along great. And then, of course, the food. You go for the cheese and for the beer. But the real reason we were there was to climb this route here. And this is a good picture of it, actually. So Zermatt is here. You start at the town of Rwanda. You go up, and right here is a hut. So you can break the trip in half. It's where Tyndall would have spent the night. And then there's glacier work here. You go to a breakfast nook, and then you go up that right-hand ridge. So Dennis and I headed up to the hut. They know how to do it in Switzerland. You get there, and you have these 5-star dinners, all the beer you want to drink. Everything is set up for you, so you really don't have to bring anything with you. They make tea for you in the morning. Everyone climbs with hot tea, mint tea, that sort of thing. We did find Tyndall's bivouac where he spent the night. You'll see the vegetation in the 2011 photo versus it's actually 74, so this is a later climb, not Tyndall's climb, but the same bivvy spot. Vegetation follows humans as a rule, which is also true, of course, in the United States, especially out west. Has big glaciers. It was bigger than I thought it was going to be. I had no experience on glaciers. If you get really close to the ribbon section on the bottom, that's sort of what it looks like. I don't know if you can tell, but there's actually a path going up that one ribbon. And then when you get near the top, it's just a lot of ice work, and I had no idea what I was doing at all. It's hard to stay away from the mountaineering tropes. It's what you get is sort of the harshness of the climb, and you almost die, but then you make it, and you're rewarded through sort of mental, physical, and spiritual upheaval or uplift. And there's a reason why that trope exists. It happens to people. I'm going to try to stay away from it as much as I can. But it was sort of this case where I was like, sure, I can do that climb. I rock climb all the time. Single pitch, double pitch stuff. I can do this. And I had no idea of the magnitude of it. We got up near the breakfast nook, so on the ridge, and the weather started rolling in. You could see it coming. These clouds were growing as we were sitting there watching them. And so we hightailed it basically back down. And we didn't climb the Weisshorn. So what we did end up doing is going and finding Tyndall's summer house in the Belle Alp. So that's where Tyndall lived. We tried every means possible to break into it, and there was just no way to get in that thing. It's amazing how tightly it was boarded up. In the back is the largest mountain in Switzerland. It's called the Dome, the largest mountain that's all in Switzerland. And it had snowed so much, we got caught in that weather. It snowed so much that we needed a climb there was no ice or glacier work, there was only snow work, and the Dome was perfect. So up there by the Belle Alp is also where Louisa Tyndall put a monument to her husband. The Aletsch Glacier in the back, one of the world's longest glaciers, is where Tyndall did all his glacial studies. And there is the Dome. And here is a picture of the route. It's basically up that center ridge. This is taken sort of up a hill above the hut. So again, you're at the hut. A big crevassed glaciers, and on the way up, it's funny, you start at 2 a.m., so you don't see any of this stuff. You just walk right over it, and then you come down later in the day, and you're like, oh my God, you know, there's humongous crevasses right there. So we'll see if this works. One of the things I didn't realize is you rope up everywhere except where it's the most dangerous, and then you unrope. Because the idea is you're not going to stop, so you're going to either kill only yourself or you're going to kill both of you. So we unroped on all of these sections. That's Dennis.
We're right below the summit, and I think this is a stopping place because the summit's pretty small. It just went through some deep snow, clouds, and now it's starting to clear up actually, which is nice. But yeah, I need something to eat, I think. But it's nice up here. Dennis is a trooper.
So altitude affects me pretty badly. And what happens to me is I can't eat or drink. And so I get very dehydrated and very nauseated. Dennis is worse. He eats all he wants and drinks all he wants. He just won't say anything. So usually right when you get in the zone for altitude sickness, 13,000, 14,000 feet, is also about the time you're getting lost and trying to find where you are. So I just ask Dennis question after question after question. He just won't answer. He won't even look at you. He just keeps walking, and you're like, Jesus, you know. So we dealt with it different, but you saw my nauseation there. Across the valley, and this is a picture from about where I was talking there, is again the Weisshorn, and you see a great shot of that eastern ridge. So we didn't get to do the Weisshorn. I came back to the United States, and we planned for a second trip up there. Meanwhile, I started this book project on not just John Tyndall, but it turns out a lot of the scientists that I'm interested in were mountaineers. For instance, Tyndall first climbed the Mont Blanc with both Huxley and a guy named T.H. Hurst, who's a famous mathematician. So I started getting interested in all of these people, and it became obvious then, and also reading sort of the commentaries at the time, this is Charles Dickens responding to the Matterhorn tragedy, actually. He hated it. He didn't know why anyone would want to climb, so he's very down on this idea. But he's making fun of this third Switzerland, which is only ascended by scientific men and their human donkeys. It's true. So the science at the time really helped establish mountaineering as a sport. I was interested in the opposite question. So how does mountaineering then itself change the type of science that you do? It actually has a pretty long history. I'm not going to hit you too hard, Kevin, but I'll say that the actual tallest mountain in the world, if you're going from the center of the earth, is that mountain there, Chimborazo, because it's so close to the equator. So Humboldt climbed Chimborazo, or attempted to climb it. It was first climbed by Whymper, actually, after the Matterhorn. But this is his rendition of Chimborazo, where you're interested in the zonation of the flora and fauna and the different kind of soils, the different sort of electrical effects you'll have, the pressure and temperature gradients, isothermal lines, iso lines of all types. That was Humboldt's sort of holistic view, that everything was rotated together, but it was done according to heights, which also then corresponded to north-south as well. So different mountain ranges had different heights for the different bands of flora and fauna and soil and everything else. Humboldt's important to us today because he's a cool guy, but also because he influenced this guy, Charles Darwin. Darwin was probably the greatest Humboldtian. He became fascinated with this idea of zonation and the zones on mountains. So when he traveled around the world. He also, and few people know this, he also climbed in South America, especially the Uppsala Pass. And he graphed out the geology of all the major places he climbed. This is my only big slide. This is a letter to his sister, and he's talking about his climbing. And in South America, I literally couldn't sleep at night for thinking over all the work. Scenery was so new and majestic, everything at an elevation of 12,000 feet bears so different an aspect from that in a lower country. This last trip has added half a mule's load. He was collecting specimens and plenty of proof, right? So this is the thing that few people know about Darwin is it was geology. He was a geologist, but it was geology that really transformed his thinking. He convinced himself of Lyell and Lyell's uniformitarian framework. And after mountaineering, but only after mountaineering, mountains sort of rose and fell in his imagination. No hypothesis was too extraordinary once you realized that there are petrified forests that used to be near the ocean that are now at the top of mountains, and fossils and these sorts of things. So it was that switch, and you can see it in his journals, that after this trip to South America, and especially to these two passes, his journals become much more imaginative. He focuses on sort of outlandish sort of theories. When he comes home, he works on it, he comes up with his theory that he's been searching for, and he first tells one person, and that's J.D. Hooker. And this letter, and you might not be able to see it, but he says, "It is like confessing a murder." So this is the first time he tells anybody about the theory of evolution through natural selection. Hooker is a great Antarctic explorer. He went with Ross on the Antarctic expedition. He's known for his Antarctic botany. And the next thing he does is hightails it to the highest mountains in the world in the Himalaya. And he does that because he knows that if he can show that, and he studied mostly rhododendra, if he could show that rhododendra actually change as elevation changes, then he can give the proof that Darwin is going to need for his hypothetical, at this point, hypothetical theory. So this is sort of the usual view you have of Hooker. He was sort of a real one of those real asshole imperialists. He created a map of Sikkim when he was there, then rode into Tibet where the Sikkim authorities wouldn't let him go because China wouldn't let him go. He does it anyway. He comes back, gets arrested, and then the British use his arrest and the map he has made to take over 1/3 of the land of Sikkim, right? So that's the kind of guy this guy is. And I do like his dog, though, Kitchen. Named after the mountain he was attempting to climb, Kinchenjunga. But it's really this vertical framework that's a better picture. This comes from his published book called the Himalayan Journals, which was dedicated then to Charles Darwin. And the big deal about this is with mountains, instead of getting on a boat and traveling for 4 months to go through 5 vegetation zones, you can do it in a day in the Himalaya, right? This is just his journals in Kew Gardens in London. You can see the upper left where, and I'll get a close-up of it, where he's putting all the different kinds of rhododendra and different species on the side. Again, few people know this, but Darwin has one chapter entirely devoted to mountain biogeography. All that material in there either comes from his own climbing in South America, but 4/5 of it is from Hooker's climbing in the Himalaya. But evolutionary theory especially has always been connected with mountaineering. The first major edited volume, Peaks, Passes, and Glaciers, it's going to turn into the Alpine Journal, which still is alive today. It published its first volume in 1859, of course, the same year as Darwin's Origin of the Species. The 3 great mountaineers, Tyndall on top, Whymper in the middle, and Leslie Stephen on the bottom. He's the editor of Dictionary of National Biography, the founder of it, the father of Virginia Woolf. They published 3 books the exact same year, 1871, Scrambles, Hours of Exercise in the Playground of Europe, all within 6 months of the descent of man. Darwin's Descent of Man. So that time period, that area overlapped. And that's really what I was interested in. Why are the same people going to the mountains that are also transforming the sciences in the 19th century? So to get back to Tyndall, the young Tyndall, this is him in 54. So kind of in the age when he started climbing, before the beard. Published 2 main mountaineering texts, The Glacier of the Alps, 1860, and Hours of Exercise in the Alps, his main one, 71. It's the 71 one that has the Weisshorn climb of 61, since he missed that one by a year. Everything else that he published of importance was in between those, basically. And that includes probably his greatest one is the Fragments of Science at the same year. And so this is the preface. Sometime short ago, I published Fragments, which might have been called Hours of Exercise in the Attic and the Laboratory. While this one bears the name Hours of Exercise in the Alps, the 2 volumes supplement each other and taken together illustrate the mode in which a lover of natural knowledge and of natural scenery chooses to spend his life. And this is the part I think that it's most important. Much as I enjoy the work, I do not think that I could fill my days and hours in the Alps with clamoring alone. Climbing in many cases was the peg on which 1,000 other exercises were hung. A man of science or anybody in the Victorian era couldn't just climb. It was ungentlemanly. You had to have a reason to do it. And even if it was a lie. So Tyndall and these guys, they went and they said that they were doing science. That's why they were going there. It wasn't true for everyone. Certainly Whymper, he did a lot of high-altitude physiology, but it was really crap science. Leslie Stevens and other people did it to publish and to write. But again, if you asked Leslie Stevens privately why he climbed, it was so he could go enjoy the mountains. He was drawn to it as a sport. But you couldn't really say that publicly. Tyndall actually did combine them, and it was this combination that I was so keen to discover. The Matterhorn, the real Matterhorn picture in the middle that I showed you before above Zermatt, you can see it on the left here in his book, Hours of Exercise in the Alps. You'll notice how much it looks like the radiation spectrum. In fact, whenever he talked about the radiation spectrum, he talked about it as the Matterhorn of heat, right? So he linked these sorts of things in all of his private writing. Tyndall is responsible for discovering the ribboned nature of glaciers. Edward Forbes, another great mountaineer, is the one that came up with our modern day theory of glacier motion. Tyndall sort of perfected it or added to it. What he would do is he would go to this Aletsch Glacier in the background. Then he would study the actual glacier, do all the work, come back, and in the attic of the Royal Institution, he would create ice molds and then squash them and pressure to create these sorts of things. The cool thing is he was doing it in a similar way that Darwin and Hooker and Humboldt and all of these other people are zoning the flora and fauna by altitude. He talks about in in Fragments of Science, he's doing the same thing, zoning or gridding the atmosphere with shells of air and shells of density. So I showed you this as the ratio photospectrometer that's really credited with the experimental verification of natural greenhouse effect. That's actually not true at all. It was actually done on 3 summits of Mont Blanc, where he set up stations throughout, and at the bottom had someone in Chamonix taking measurements, left guides and porters at other stations, and then they took measurements throughout of the sun's rays and the absorption of the sun's rays with pocket spectroscopy. That's not right, Dave, the physicist. Spectrometer, thank you, Dave. I knew you'd come in handy. Similarly with the Weisshorn, where the Weisshorn has this ridge. If the video works, you'll see it. It's this knife-edge ridge. And he tells a story about Benin, his guide, crossing it. And it's such a scary move, and it's such a scary spot. Tyndall focuses entirely on the physical science behind it, because Michael Faraday, his mentor, had shown about 15 years earlier that if you compress ice together, huge ice blocks, they'll cohere. And so he describes the granules under Benen's feet as cohering, and the reason why, he says, Benen would do something without any lick of knowledge of science that I would never do for, ever in my life, right? So even in this climb, his greatest climb, when he tells the story, it's really science and not mountaineering. And then there was one final reason that I really wanted to go back to Switzerland. And that's because I hooked up with this group. It's a nonprofit out of Bozeman, Montana, but it's now gone sort of global. The Greg Tiernish, the guy that runs it, is now sort of a superstar. He's National Geographic adventurer and does all this stuff. He started this nonprofit called Adventurers and Scientists for Conservation. And what it does is you can go to their website and get hooked up with them. And if you're going mountaineering or going to Greenland or going anywhere that's extreme, you can sign up with scientific research programs that are being set up. And they'll link you. And it could be, glacier ice worms. It could be pica, counting picas. In my case, it was studying the erosion, the microbe erosion that occurs in rocks at high altitude. So flew back to Switzerland, same damn tent, same city, and same mountain. It really had a hold on me for the year. This time we got a bit further. That's the breakfast nook where Tyndall and Benen had the first their only breakfast of the day. You leave about 2 a.m. You get there about 5:30 or 6. Tyndall had written this, and I didn't even really pay a lot of attention to the details of the mountaineering, because when I read all this stuff, I wasn't really interested in that. But he said, it's the last place to get water. And so he and Benen were just dehydrated all day. They had taken champagne with them in case they succeeded, and they ended up drinking all of it, mixing it with snow and drinking all of it on the way up. Well, it turns out it's the last place to get water. And Dennis and I had a very similar experience. This is Dennis after the main ridge section. One of my favorite pictures of Dennis. You'd think that's staged, but it's not. Dennis is the climber in the group. I'm the one that says I'm not doing well, and he's the one that says you're going to be okay. I'm going to get you out of this. I'm the one that sees one little bitty cloud, and I'm like, Dennis, it is going to storm. In about 15 minutes, he says, Michael, it's a little cloud. Dude, you're going to be okay. This climb, he was the one about 3/4 of the way up. He just said, I am just not feeling very well at all. He ended up pulling it together, but it really freaked me out, because he's always the one that got us down. We'll see if these work. Come on, Benen. Sun's coming up. That's the dome behind it. Good day to be on the Matterhorn, I bet. Better day to be on top of that. I'm going to stay safe, but I'm going to do it, I think. This is when my mom says, that is what you call staying safe? So here the rope is important. If you fall, theoretically, your responsibility, the person who doesn't fall, is to then jump off the other side. Makes me ill actually looking at it today. Vice Hunter's about 15,000. This is probably 13,500.
No oxygen?
No. 3,000 feet on each. Oh.
That's
So yeah, that was I think one of the scariest things I've ever done, and why I'll never ever do it again. There's funny stories about that day. There's so many of them. I don't even know where to start. I think the best one is a guy we called Solo Man. There was a guy up there who started kind of with us, and we kind of hopscotched each other the whole way, and he's just by himself. And we ended up summiting together with him. And we're taking videos, and I'm making all these videos for the Tyndall transcribers, and talking about Tyndall stuff, and we're toasting Benin. He gets there behind us and asks if he can take our picture for us, and we said, sure, thank you. And so Dennis and I get to do that. And then he leaves, and we say, hey, do you want us to take your picture? And he says, no, man, I can't. My wife can't know I'm up here. And then he just walked right on down. And he must have been, he was 70, I would say. And so, the way we were huffing and puffing when we got there and how scared I was. And then this 70-year-old guy just walks up, takes off. It was incredible. So this is when I started. This is for, so what we had done is we'd hook up with this guy named Dragos Serzuska. And Dragos works at the Biosphere 2 laboratory at the University of Arizona. It's about, 500 meters. And his research is all on microbes that have to be collected above snowline. He's especially interested in the European Alps. So I call him up. I was like, yeah, Dragos, my name's Michael, and we're heading to Switzerland. And he was so excited, man. I was the best laboratory assistant you could have possibly had, right? I did everything by the book because I was so excited, as a historian and a dirtbag climber, that I would actually get to participate in this stuff. So when I got back, I badgered him as much as he had badgered me, and I'd send him all the samples, and I kept on asking when all the research was going to be published and where my name was going to be on it. So I got a couple videos for him. They're short.
Dragos, this is for you, man. We're on top of the Weisshorn, and we're going to start taking rock samples here down. That's your first one. Was right there. It's going to have a little snow on it because there's snow around. And we'll get it every 200. The summit's 4505. And you can see that it's going to be a little rocky at top, but then it's just snow covered until you get to the rocks over there. All right, dude.
And this is just a couple of us, I think, gathering them.
Hi, Dragos. This is our second one. Our third one. You can see we're bagging it without touching it. We got the GPS unit on it. And we're in a pretty cool spot. So, number 3, aspect east.
There's nothing worse than hearing yourself talk.
It's pretty warm. What was the temperature?
Switzerland's really interesting. It gets freezing cold if there's any kind of cloud cover, and extremely hot if there's not. I think it has, of course, to do with altitude, but I've heard it's especially true in the summer in the Swiss Alps. So it was extremely cold going up in the morning, which is why I have that backpack. I mean, there's nothing much in the backpack except cold weather gear. And then it got hotter and hotter and hotter as the day went on until I think maybe maybe not, but at the end we were, in short sleeve shirts coming off. So that was the big problem. I think you will see a small little video of the top knife edge ridge. Going up, it was perfect. The conditions were perfect. There was not a cloud in the sky, and that was great because what you're worried about in Switzerland is weather coming in and getting caught in anything, and I worry like crazy about it. But if there's nothing in the forecast, we just knew we were going to be okay. It was a perfect day for it. The bad part is it turned everything to slush, so we were going on that ridge, and every step you would have to raise your foot and knock it out, your crampons out with your knife axe. So you were doing the whole thing on one leg, and it just took us forever. So, the climb, real mountaineers will do it in about 16 hours. We did up in 6 or so. We summited about 9:30 in the morning, But then it took us 16 to get down. So it was a 22-hour climb. So it was just way too long, and it was just way too exhausting. And it was partly because of our inexperience, but also because the weather was so warm and the snow got really slushy. All right, I think this is our last one. 006 was right here on the top of this. There's actually a belay spot, and it was south facing toward the sun. So you notice I didn't get any videos of that. That was scary. And so that's actually Dennis had to take one sample because it hit that 200 meters while it was on rappel, which wasn't the plan. But I was such a stickler about it. It was kind of funny because it turns out, of course, Dragos is like, oh yeah, it doesn't really matter. And but that was after we had gotten back. So I was like, no, Dennis, you have to, you know. So he set up this rappel contraption that could stop him. He could do it. It was funny. So I'm 47 minutes in. They told me between 45 and an hour, so I'm doing good. I think I'll just wrap it up and say maybe a minute or two of conclusion, and we can go to questions. And I'll just end with maybe some quotes to try to think about it. Leslie Stephen, a great mountaineer, wrote this, probably the quintessential book in history of mountaineering. You know, the scientists were doing it, zoning everything, and he was putting his finger on the pulse. That travelers, of course, like plants, are zoned in the mountains. And he put in the third that it was the English climber, whose peculiarities are pretty well known, is by far the most abundant genus. It's true. British mountaineers, especially mid-19th century, sort of created the sport of mountaineering. And I guess that's one of the lessons about this talk, that it was sort of these British scientists in particular. But they did so to actually help their research. Global warming, the natural greenhouse effect turns into global warming now, which is why there's a climate change center named after John Tyndall in England, and why Tyndall's getting a little bit better known. If evolution wasn't being dictated whether you could teach it in schools or not in Mississippi and places, then Tyndall's naturalistic worldview wouldn't sound so prescient. But there's also precedence to the kind of people that go to the tops of mountains today. We talk about, they don't often look like scientists and these sorts of things, because a lot of times they're not. They're mountaineers. But a lot of science gets done in the mountains today. There's a science, American Science Research Group. I've got this written down, actually, because I was going to forget it. There's an American Science Research climbing group that's going down to South America and Peru to set up retro photography cameras on all high alpine glaciers. There's Conrad Anker, who the film Meru was just made about. He has set up all sorts of biological and glacial science study stuff in the Himalayas. Again, adventurers and scientists are doing, they must have 40 different projects that they need sort of this citizen science network to participate in. So that's sort of the other lesson about this, is the citizen science aspect to it. If the 19th century gentlemen of science were still not scientists yet, they weren't specialized and professionalized yet as such, they were basic citizens who love going to high places and love doing that kind of mountaineering. You're seeing sort of not a resurgence of that, but it's never left us. So mountaineering and high altitude adventure are important. Things like, Dragos wouldn't know that the most abundant genus isn't the British climber, of course. It's the microbe-eating organisms that he's studying, right? And people like Dragos want to learn about them so that we can protect them. You're not going to protect what you don't understand. And so people are taking serious Tyndall's vertical orientation and doing that sort of research that's been alive and well now since Humboldt 200 years ago. And then just the last slide, it's one of my favorite guys. Another guy no one knows about, William Clifford. He died way too young. He was a friend of Tyndall's and Hooker and Huxley. He was a genius. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 31. But he wrote a book called Cosmic Emotion. And he talked about the difference of what it took to have cosmic emotion. And it was about experience. He was a great agnostic. They all were. They were atheists, really, but they couldn't say that. They were agnostics. And the way he defined it was against, nature worshipers against seekers after truth. And a lot of people looked at Tyndall and these climbers, just as you look at climbers today, as sort of nature worshipers. But there's a higher sort of truth that they're looking for. And I think, just like Tyndall, and many of them today, that they get sort of pigeonholed as nature worshipers, but I think they've always been, certainly Tyndall was, a seeker after truth. So I think I'll end it right there.
Thank you so much. I see hands going up, and I am going to try to make the rounds with the microphone per usual, so we can get your voices heard maybe on the podcast and certainly to the rest of the audience here.
Would you elaborate on the importance of the change in rhododendrons with the mountain zones? I didn't understand the implications of that.
Yeah, okay. So it's actually one of Darwin's most convincing arguments, I think, and it's why, this doesn't exactly answer your question, but it's a roundabout way. Why there is the same or similar species on the tops of mountain ranges that are separated by humongous valleys, where you don't have that same species in the valleys. And so he needed observations of the types of rhododendron you have on different ranges, or the same ranges but different tops of mountains, without there being that type of rhododendron in between. So the way the argument goes for Darwin is it's linked to sort of long-term climactic change. So when it's warm, when it's chilly, all of the rhododendron, same kind of species, are in the valleys and they're just having a great time. But then the cold or the warm comes in, and they have to travel up to stay in their same zone, and they travel up in two different sides, right? And you get a disappearing of those rhododendron in the middle. So if he could show, and this is basic argument he says we've got one of two options here. One is God put the same kind of rhododendron. They're actually not the same. They're variations of the same because variety occurs as you move up. Either God places them there, and it's just a meticulous worker and has no time to do anything else, or, right, you have this gradual change over time. That's why the quote that mountains are islands on land, because he needed that island aspect to it, because it's islands that really create the barriers that is the best way to show evolutionary theory. I like that quote because we always look at the Galapagos for its islands as sort of the main argument. Darwin puts much more faith in the mountain biogeography in his notebooks and other things leading up to the origin of species, and then gives it a whole chapter.
So you said in the beginning that Tyndall and these other guys were naturalists and stuff, and I'm curious, did he see mountain climbing as partially spiritual and partially a triumph of rationality over nature, or was it all one or the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Huxley, who coined the term agnostic, and Tyndall both, I think they're very spiritual people. They just didn't believe in God. And they understood the role of religion as well. And just as long as it wasn't part of science or the scientific process. But they were agnostics. And what I think is interesting is it's a twist on it in the mountains. They go up there. Leslie Stephen is also the great great agnostic, and both of them do this in their journals and letters, and then later in their publications, where they actually go to test their creed. So, sort of there are no atheists in foxholes. They put themselves in danger to see if in the end they are going to turn to a God. And they both say, no way. Leslie Stephen does it in this great article called Last 5 Minutes in the Alps. And it's sort of a fictitious tale, but it really happened to it, but he calls it fiction. But he missteps on this ledge and is holding on by a hand, and there's a drop of like 2,000 feet, and he tells what goes on in his mind for that 5 minutes. And he says he tests out all of the creeds from Epicureans to Catholicism to everything. And in the end, he ends up falling. But right before he falls, he says, you know what, in the end, all I really want to do is go back to the hut and have a cold beer. And he ends up falling, but he didn't see the ledge. It was only 5 feet away, and he falls on the ledge. And he goes back to the hut and has a beer. And so it's a difficult question. I think the way that the mountaineering fits in with it is a way to test your new creed of a spirituality based on to be able to talk about godliness without including God, or to be able to create a creed based on nature and not on a Christian religion. So I think that would be the best way to put it. If you ask Tyndall scholars, they would call him a pantheist, actually.
A couple of things. I hadn't read about Tyndall, but I have about Humboldt. And it seems like he was even more worldwide importance at an earlier era that we don't hear about anymore, even though we know his name from various things. And the other thing, wasn't there a transcendentalist movement in this country prior to what you're talking about, that we went through a lot of God searching and who is this guy?
Yeah, so the first point is right on. I think everyone should know about Humboldt. He's, I think, one of the most important figures, not only because he does influence people like Tyndall and certainly Darwin and others, but because his holistic approach to the environment is actually quite amazing. His environmentalism, and he was already talking about it. He says you want to know, why trees are, or why a sea in South America is going down. They thought it was emptying out into the ocean. He says you got to look at global geopolitics. It has to do with timber sales and the boat industry, and he links everything with the environment to humans and humans' desires and needs, right? And the end result was always for social justice. So it's this weird sort of, it sounds like really cool environmentalism these days, right? Where you do see that everything is interconnected. And it is big agribusiness and big governments. And you really have to solve those problems, and you should do it with an eye towards social justice. Humboldt, I swear to you, had that in 1819. Right? And it's just now being reinvented. So you're exactly right. We do know about a little bit with the Humboldt squid and the Humboldt current. His brother was also a great man who was an educator, and that's where the Humboldt University and places come from. To your second point, you're asking me about American history, and I don't know much about it. I think you're right. Tyndall is not a special character in this way. I think, at least it's my way of doing history, is these people aren't one of a kind, sort of brilliant. They are signs of their times. They grow out of a culture that is ready for this. And I think Tyndall, to me, sort of represents a mid-Victorian working toward end of Victorian era middle class, sort of character. So it wouldn't surprise me if you find a lot of examples in people that look just like Tyndall and what they're doing and what they're saying.
I just want to know a little about that Zago, the Arizona guy, what what he discovered that is out there?
So the results that Dragos? I don't know. I was really into it until Dragos sort of started. I wanted results to come out in a month, and because that's how I figured scientists work. I know historians take like 5 years, but I figured science would be like this. It's taken them a long time. They are publishing on it now. I mean, this was 5 years ago. In fact, he still sends me some of the stuff, and he just gave a talk on it in San Francisco and things like that. It is true that these microbes are responsible for early erosion. So he sort of verified early hypotheses. And I always ask him, did you get that from my samples? And it's sort of like my partner, alpaca farmer. I want to know which alpaca is in my socks. And it turns out they just get all mixed up together. And you can't pull out the alpaca, and he can't pull out my rocks. And once I realized it wasn't my rocks necessarily, I kind of gave up on it.
Hi. Do you have another big climb in mind?
It was one more slide I was supposed to get to. This is Mount Kenya in Kenya. It's it's second highest peak in Africa. It was first climbed by the father of geography in Britain, a guy named Mackinder. So the standard route is the Mackinder route. The biggest glacier that you're looking at there that you kind of weave up is the Darwin Glacier. And then you have to go up, and it's a side one facing that way. But the second biggest glacier is the Tyndall Glacier. So you go through the Darwin Glacier and the Tyndall Glacier to get to what's about a 10-pitch rock climb, which is what I'm much better at than ice and stuff. And so we always wanted to do that one and had planned it for a couple years. Kenya's not the safest place in the world. And then I broke my back. And so it put it on hold. So we need funding for it now. I couldn't do this through the Tyndall project. So we'll have to rewrite grants and get some funding for it, maybe through citizen science stuff, and then try to drum up about 10 grand. And then it's a very doable climb. And Mackinder, the guy that first did it, is a fascinating character. He started the first geography program at Oxford in England in 1899, hired all the faculty, set all the syllabi he'd been working on in the government for 10 years to allow him to do it. They finally did it. They allowed him to do it. And the railroad to Nairobi got close enough where he could do this climb. So he drops everything about 5 days before the semester begins and goes to Kenya, gets on this railroad. And it's the famous railroad with all the man-eaters that all the lions ate all the railroad workers. They lost like 39 people or something. They made a movie out of it with Val Kilmer. And
Ghost in the Darkness.
And so Ghost in the Darkness, you know it. You get a prize. And so, he goes and then climbs it but in purposefully imperial terms. It's about owning. You just had the partition of Africa, and so the middle of it between the Germans and the British is kind of open, and so you want to grab territories, and the Germans had just climbed Kilimanjaro, the first highest peak, so he said the British have to climb this one so that we can control the water resources of all of West Africa. So it's this real imperial story, this fascinating imperialist character, and a climbable mountain. So that was kind of our next one.
Pertaining to the logistics of the citizen science partnerships that you're talking about, I understand why it's a benefit. Well, obviously the mountaineers going up the mountain, Drago needs somebody to go up the mountain. But in terms of funding projects and/or funding trips, what's the next step then? Are you writing grants together, or are there resources that are in Arizona that send you up the mountain?
Yeah, so it was actually the Tyndall grant money that sent me to Switzerland a couple years. It wouldn't be through Dragos and the scientists. I think It would either be our research group in history at Montana State. We have a lot of environmental historians. We specialize in environmental history. And so they're into this sort of stuff too. But it's also with the nonprofits, the Greg Tiernish's group. They get a lot of federal funding and private funding for doing this stuff. And so they give grants. Alpine clubs, both American Alpine and the British Alpine Club, offer small scale. You know, you don't need a lot of money for these things. You need 10 grand. And so there's actually quite a few outlets that we've gone to in the past and will continue to go to in the future. Yeah.
Your next book?
Yeah, so the first book my first book was on 19th century tides, the history of 19th century tidal theory. And believe me, it is as boring as you think it would be. And you know, I forgot to make this point, and it's a point that needs to be made about this work, is I was writing about a bunch of rivers and a bunch of coastlines that I'd never visited and didn't know about. And you know, I don't think I got anything wrong, but I didn't have what Wallace Stegner would call a sense of place. And so this book, the question is about this book. This book, it's going to be about 7 different scientists doing 7 different sciences on 7 different continents. Africa would be one, the last one. That's 1899. Humboldt is the first one with Chimborazo in 1799. And you have the Darwin chapters and the Tyndall chapters and the Hooker, et cetera, et cetera. But the beauty about this stuff, and why I really want to go to Kenya, is it does give you a sense of place. You do know the places that are being talked about. You understand, you know, when they talk about a river crossing, you know, what is it, a little stream? Is it a big, huge river? Do they change from morning to the afternoon in the power of the river? What does a month of August look like with that? What kind of temperatures are they doing? You know, all of these sorts of things you only get if you actually go experience it. I think historians don't do enough of that. A lot of science historians, and I'm a historian of science, they recreate the instruments, you know, like Galileo's telescope and stuff. So there is a vein of doing this sort of thing, but much less, I think, with travel and experience in those places. So while the first book was extremely boring, and I admit it, this one I'm hoping will sort of include a little bit of my own material, my own experiences, have a little bit more fun with it, and be for sort of a mountaineering and popular audience, and not just the 3 people that bought my last book.
Will the Bell Museum carry it?
We were talking about that a little bit earlier. Do you have a projected publish date?
I got to write it.
Okay. So we'll talk. I'll get back to you on that.
Maybe we could get back copies of the other book.
Yeah. Send them.
You can get them on Amazon for like $3. They're giving them away, basically.
Excellent. That might come at a weird, by the time it's out, it might be when we're transitioning between buildings. So that's, but we'll link to it for sure if you send us the information. Any last questions for Michael? All right. Great. Thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to listen to you tell your stories tonight and to learn about John Tyndall. Thanks everybody for being here, and we hope to see you next Café.